suggestion. That's one thing. What I like about, that there are different ways to read the Quran. There's the way to read the Quran. You're looking at the words. And in one thing, Ibn al-Qayyim actually talked about the reward for reading the Quran, and the reward for reading the Quran, meaning like with orally, that is. And the reward he said it was different to actually look at the words. So when you look at the words and also read, he said that there's a particular barakah. And I would add that there's also with tadabbur, and that's what we try to do. That tadabbur. What is it, tadabbur? Tadabbur actually means you're trying to relate to the ayat in such a way that you are trying to go to the back of it. You're trying to go to the bottom of it. You're trying to encompass it on all ends to get the best view ever. When you get the best view of something, you get the taste of it, you get to the texture of it, you get to blend with it, you get to somehow feel a certain sensation that you would not normally feel at other times unless you actually had the best view in seeing the at least that particular thing that you're trying to scrutinize on in from different angles. That's why there's the sound of something, there's the texture of it, there's the taste of it, there's the actual shape or the image of it. And there's sometimes that you go deep inside to really see, well, what does that look like on the inside? And subhanallah, and that's why the Arab used the word tadawwuq, because they would consider tadawwuq. Look at that one. In Lugha Arabiya, Arab and Lugha Arabiya. I'm not talking about the Arab, as in person, okay? I'm actually talking about the language itself, because the Arab today are not the Arab of the past, okay? Trust me, they're not the Arab of the past. They had really lost a lot of the different meanings of what it means to be Arab, what it means to be a person of Aruba, and a person of what it really means to, I guess, be a part of this language, a part of this rich culture, this rich texture. Let's say it that way. Today, they're really completely watered down. Anyhow, in اللغة العربية, we would see that they use the word تذوق. Why تذوق? The word ذاق actually means to taste, okay? But they regarded that food has a lot more than just the taste to it. Food has to have a certain smell. Food has to have a certain appearance. Food has to have a texture. So that's why for those that, love food, and, just the way you present food has one very important side to it. The way that it tastes, the smell of it, the sound of it sizzling, and all of that. Every single piece that relates to that food actually adds on to the taste. It adds on to the taste. And that's the same thing when you talk about tadawwuq al-Quran. What does it sound like? When you read it, what is the sensation it's giving you? When you see it, when you see the words, and you see the words whether in written format, or you see the words in the reflection in the universe around you, what does that look like? When you learn more and you go deep into the words, what do you get? When you connect these words with other appetizers, what is the other taste that you would get? Sorry to bring it into food, but when they talk about tadawwuq, they also had a rich taste even in food, and regarded that, no, when you add something else to it, yes, they're definitely like not like the Indians in putting in at least that the richness in terms of spices, and definitely not like the Persians either, because they didn't have these resources. But when they did manage to get them, that's when they basically had that combination come in. And that's that tadawuq in al-Quran. The same idea, the same concept is also there. Getting that sensation by listening to it, looking at it, feeling it, having that texture, going deep inside and trying to see all those dimensions in order to get the best view, the best inspiration, the best sensation. And that's how you delve deep into the Quran. That's how you delve deep. And that's why when you look at, for example, Ustaza Umayyah was actually asking about mafatih and mafatih and miftah and all of that. When you look at mafatih al-ghaib, for example, and she was emphasizing that it was talking about uh, the key itself. Was it really talking about something materialistic that you could really see, or was it talking about something like an idea? An idea, we would also use the word miftah on it, that there's a certain key to it. But it isn't a key, as I was emphasizing, it isn't a particular key that we would usually visualize, and that there's something, locked in some kind of I don't know, a treasure box or whatever, and that we're getting something materialistic in order to open it up. But the opening, that's the key word. The opening is a lot more comprehensive than thinking of it as something locked within a limited space. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was showing us that comprehensiveness to tell us, لا يعلمها يعلم ما في السماوات يعلمها إن ورقة ما تسقط من ورقة إلا يعلمها حبة. And of course, in order to tell us that if الحبة in ظلمات الأرض رطب ياء ولا يابس, etc. It's in order to show encompassment. Encompassment for what? That الغيب itself is a lot more comprehensive than thinking of it as something that is locked in some box. But it's so comprehensive that al-ihata, or that encompassment, just like in Ayat al-Kursi, that wording that is used in Ayat al-Kursi, Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayyul qayyum, la ta'khudhuhu sinatun wa la nawm, له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض, من ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه, يعلم. That's that point right there. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was showing us that encompassment in terms of different dimensions, the different creations in the world. And he said, له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض. Everything belongs to the Lord Almighty in the heavens and the earth. له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض. من ذا الذي يشفع عنده. If you don't control the different things in the heavens and the earth, then you really cannot be a person that is considered as an intercessor slash vicegerent slash in any way an assistant to control anything in this universe. So that's why he was bringing it in a sense for us to recognize that encompassment. And he said, وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ. And they don't even have that encompassment, not even close, not even understand the dimensions and how big and how vast this is. وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ. It doesn't mean that, well, of course, if you don't have the small amount, well, certainly you're not going to be able to have the big amount. But this isn't telling you about that you're not capable of getting the large amount, but it's telling you that you don't even have the idea, the ability to comprehend, visualize, imagine, or even have your intelligence to imagine and comprehend the vastness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ilm, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's encompassment. And certainly, this was actually talking about al-ghaib. And that's the same thing when we relate it to this ayah, that it was actually telling us that al-ghaib itself is further than thinking of it as something that is locked within a certain space or a certain boundary. How far does this boundary or this space actually extend to? It extends where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling, well, لا يعلمها. You have no ability to comprehend the vastness of this ghaib, and even we could just give you just a taste of it. وَيَعْلَمُ مَا فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ. The knowledge of the Lord Almighty, it extends farther than the surface on the land or even the depth of the sea and even the things that are controlled. Now, notice here, it's talking about what is on the sea, what is on the land, but then it went into telling us about a certain movement, that the encompassment basically goes farther than the actual items to actually control even the process of how things function. So even when we speak about a leaf falling, that it actually is controlled by the Lord Almighty. Each and every single thing that you would see, whether in function or whether idle, that it's basically encompassed by the Lord Almighty. That's in order to tell us that il-fath is farther than thinking of it as encompassed within a space, but it actually means it's beyond your ability to comprehend. It's beyond theory to explain. It's beyond your rational mind to probably think that they could somehow be able to be able to perhaps research or even get to see that it's extending farther than that. لا يعلمها إلا هو. And same thing, ولا حبة في ظلمات الأرض ولا رطب ولا يابس. ولا رطب ولا يابس إلا في كتاب مبين. When you look at إلا في كتاب مبين, but in a book that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically left with him. Now, we want to look at a couple things here. Okay, when we say kitab mubin, notice that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had included every single ghaib, every single piece of thing that, whether on a shore or whatever it is, that we're basically on the same piece of it. And that's why when we look at the ayat, when we look at the ayat, when we look at the ayat, it's basically to reflect the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, basically to reflect the encompassment. Let's continue right there. Yesterday we left off at the third point right there. And in the third point, let's see right there, وَيَعْلَمُ مَا فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ. يَعْلَمُ مَا فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ. And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned al-bar. Now, of course, we're trying to work on Tafseer al-Qurtubi to really see what al-Qurtubi had wanted to say in regards to this tafsir. Al-Qurtubi said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned in particular land and sea in order to let us know that encompassment, and certainly because it is basically containing the best or at least the most magnificent things in terms of creation. Okay. and that the Lord Almighty knows whether something was destructed on land or sea, or whether something was living on land or sea, or whether something was functioning on land or sea, or needing rizq on land or sea, that it's basically coming from the Lord Almighty. And that's why you would say that some scholars actually considered mafatih al-ghaib to relate to rizq, to relate to provision. Other scholars, they related rizq or al-ghaib here is more than making it exclusive to just provision. In other words, something that would make you continue in your existence, but it's more comprehensive to basically mean to control every function of things, the function of whether we're speaking about gravity that controls or holds a leaf that would fall on earth and not necessarily fly in space. That's in order to tell us the different things that you may or may not notice as a power and basically as some force. That force is basically controlled by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's the key thing, is that the force of things, whether a force that is deep in the darkness of the different palettes of earth, or whether we're speaking about the different levels of darkness, that everything is basically controlled by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the actual matter, and even in the actual force, in the function that it would basically have surrounding it. This is extremely important. In the actual function itself, how do we understand function? Now, why did the ayah actually mention that one? There is a philosophy, I think it was Plato, I can't remember, don't take my word for it. I think it was Plato that had mentioned that, of course, he believed in God, but considered that God had created the world and just let everything within matter just basically function on its own. In other words, considered that God created everything and then put the force within matter, and then that matter basically takes the position to whether evolve or whether move on and procreate or whatever it is on its own. In other words, the matter itself becomes God. The matter itself becomes the force to give itself to continuation, or give itself basically the ability to move on. And certainly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in Islam, of course, unfortunately, we had some Muslim scholars, I would say, well, they're actually mubtadi'ah, okay? That's actually near kufr to believe that. Okay, to believe that matter on its own functions, and that itself is the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is a dangerous thing to say, because what we would say is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that not only is he aware of these things, but he is the one that controls everything. To believe in evolution, for example, that it basically works on its own and not controlled by the Lord Almighty, is a form of kufr. But to believe that, yes, evolution can happen, we're talking about evolution in different species, not human beings, because human beings, it's a very dangerous thing to talk about evolution in human beings, because then that's going to take you all the way to Prophet Adam alayhi salam, and then disregard all the different ayat that relate to Prophet Adam alayhi salam as not necessarily being evolved from another species, but actually created on his own as a separate species. Okay. Now, when we're speaking about that piece of evolution, to regard that, no, it is actually controlled by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself in the different ayat did actually talk about development of different creatures from other creatures. So the Quran itself was actually talking to us about some form of evolution, but that's basically controlled by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's controlled by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not nature itself acting as God and actually doing the whole function or the whole evolution or the whole force itself. In other words, making matter itself be God and actually control everything. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَعْلَمُ مَا فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ, it's in order to let us recognize whether He knows about it or whether the function of it. And that's why I emphasize تَسْقُطُ مِنْ وَرَقَةٍ إِلَّا يَعْلَمُهَا, whether we're speaking about the knowledge or whether we're speaking about the function of it. Let's see, within this ayah, it basically said, and it was said, يعلم ما البر من النبات والحب والنوى. That it's basically to show encompassment or comprehensiveness, that He would basically know what is on land from the different plants, or whether in other words, they more wanted to relate to the different plants, that if the plants basically exist on sea, or whether we're talking about the different seeds, or whether we're speaking about the sprout of this that sprout of that seed. So they were looking at it that that here يعلم ما في البر والبحر وما تسقط من ورقة. They considered, at least some of the scholars considered, that if it's talking about a leaf and it's talking about a seed and it's talking about a ratab, meaning that it's a moist seed, or is it a dry seed, or something that is it necessarily a seed? And that's why the scholars that said al-Badri wal-Bahr wanted to relate to the vegetation on land, and on sea. So they considered that it was relating to the vegetation. So whether this vegetation lies on land or lies in sea, or whether it's this vegetation is basically dropping from a tree, or whether it's a part of within its early form as a seed in the different levels of earth, or whether it's sprouting and it was ratib, or whether in its late stage as becoming as basically a dried stage. So is this talking about different stages of plants, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just as He controls the different stages of plants? That's really interesting here, that it's basically also referring to the stages of human beings. That the stages of human beings, whether, of course, metaphorically, according to some scholars, this is absolutely just like Ibn Atiyah. Ibn Atiyah considered that is not acceptable to do this kind of metaphorical exegesis or metaphorical explanation whatsoever. But some scholars wanted to relate, well, what are we looking at here? Why the emphasis of what's on land and sea? Is it giving us the idea, at least, that if the Lord Almighty is capable of being encompassing a seed, whether it's on land, on sea, or whether it's falling from a tree, or whether it's basically a seed that is already in nothing but as a seed, and then sprouting in it, and then finally in its late stage it's becoming yabis. But all these different stages are controlled by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that it's not necessarily controlled by matter that is controlling its life, but it's basically controlled by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is this really letting us as human beings recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He encompasses a seed in those different stages, in those different areas, whether land, on sea, or whether it's in the fall time, or whether it becomes a seed. In other words, even you as a human being, whether you're on land or on sea, or whether you're basically going through, let's say, tasqut, here it is, you're right now going through probably your mid-age and you're falling, or you're probably going through your mid-age crisis, or whatever it is, or probably a seed that is planted in earth, whether it's we're talking about a new generation happening, or whether it's talking about when that new generation sprouts and that new generation becomes then basically dead, and what really happens to the different let's call it the different phases of life. Is this referring to the different phases of life, whether the different phases of a seed, or whether the different phases of a human being and the development of a human being, and that it's basically encompassed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because when you look at, that's why those scholars that related to, it's actually talking about, sorry, not al-barr min al-nabat, but it's al-burr min al-nabat. So now that, some scholars actually said, no, it's actually talking about al-burr to actually mean things like barley, wheat, that this is not talking about al-barr and al-barr as basically land, but al-burr as well as the different plants that would be on land, or perhaps the different vegetation that is grown in sea, or whether it's a vegetation that is on a tree. So we're talking about different plantations, different plants on land, on sea, and probably even standing on a tree, or probably another vegetation that is as a seed on earth, or whether it's basically going through the different stages beyond earth and sprouting, or whether it basically gone to its final stage and becoming basically nothing but dry veggie. So what are we looking at? Are we looking at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showing us encompassment as to see and ponder in a small seed, and see the lesson that you are not, as a human being, you're not any different, whether you were as a sperm in your mother's womb, or whether you basically were planted in your mother's womb. And certainly it's like a plant, because you become stuck into the womb, and then it starts growing, and then it basically, here we go, tasqutu min waraqa, now you're being delivered, just exactly the same idea, you're being delivered, then you're basically starting to grow again, and you're growing outside of your mother's womb. And then once you grow outside of your mother's womb, you basically go through different stages, and finally you become basically lose your moisture. As you grow older, you basically lose the amount of water in your body, you lose the amount of moisture, you basically become harder and harder to basically end in death, and certainly become again to the final stage of nothing but yabis. Is this really giving me an idea to just picture and see the simile? And this is extremely important. When we're talking about al-burr min al-nabat, we're speaking about, is it really letting us or wanting us to see the different stages, the different things, the items that we basically go through these similar paradigms, and that we cannot go outside of the different forces that control the world, or the different forces that control life, or the different forces that basically control existence, or control life, or control the function of things. Let's see right here. In a narration on Ibn Umar, Ibn Umar narrated that the Prophet ﷺ had said, ما من زرع على الأرض ولا ثمار على الأشجار ولا حبة في ظلمات الأرض إلا عليها مكتوب بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رزق فلان ابن فلان. What does that mean? وذلك قوله في محكم كتابه وما تسقط من ورقة إلا يعلمها ولا حبة, etc. Okay. What is this hadith saying? Every single plant on earth, or a fruit on a tree, or a seed in the darkness of the earth, but on it is written Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, most merciful, most beneficent. This is the provision for X ibn X, or X ibn X would actually mean Fulan ibn Fulan, but yeah. So basically telling us who this person is for. Now, one thing is that this hadith is actually not authentic. So that's why basically mentioned it right there. He said, Al-Khatib fi Tarikh Baghdad. Tarikh Baghdad is actually, Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, okay, is actually a very huge book. It's almost in, I would say almost 23, 24 volumes. It's a huge book. although it's not a book of hadith per se, it's more a book of history than anything else. But he did actually mention certain hadith that were not mentioned elsewhere. Where was he from? He was from Iraq. He was from Baghdad. Okay. And al-Wahidi also mentioned it. Who's al-Wahidi again? Well, al-Wahidi was that scholar that basically had written Asbab al-Nuzul, the reasons for the different revelations, and Ibn al-Jawzi. Man, Ibn al-Jawzi, one thing about Ibn al-Jawzi, okay? Ibn al-Jawzi is one of these scholars that I must admit I couldn't really completely understand very well, to be honest. He is such, well, he was from Syria, just to Ibn al-Jawzi, okay? And he wrote books on tazkiyah, okay? And those books are perhaps the best books written on tazkiyah. I don't think there are any other better books than Ibn al-Jawzi's books. But he's not only a scholar of tazkiyah, but you could see that he's even a scholar on hadith. What confuses me about him? His misogyny. And I really mean this guy is a women hater. All right. Why would I even mention that one? Sisters, it can happen. You can have a scholar be a great scholar, but just because you may dislike something about a certain scholar, learn how not to cancel a particular scholar and deny the ilm that they have, certainly or probably because you dislike something about them, whether they're misogyny or whatever, and think that, wait a minute, why is that the case? Okay. You want to remember that العلماء العلماء are human beings. العلماء are human beings, and therefore you want to keep in mind that they too make mistakes. And learn how to embrace the khair whenever someone has it. And whenever somebody may produce something that you may not like, be a bee that looks for pollen, and don't be a fly that looks for, let's just say, the bad things. Okay. But be the bee that looks for the pollen wherever it may be. Even if you may dislike something about a certain scholar, it doesn't mean you cancel them out. Anyhow, so Ibn al-Jawzi, a great scholar in hadith, a great scholar in tazkiyah as well, he also had mentioned that this hadith actually contains a problem within its chain of narration. Okay. And he said Ibn Nu'aym had mentioned that this hadith was actually something تفرد به حموي, is it? I don't know if that's his name. I don't know if you actually read his name like that, Ibn al-Husayn. Regardless, that it's basically a hadith that doesn't actually have, let's say, supporting evidence. Why did I even mention it if it's mentioned in Tafseer al-Qurtubi? There are certain hadith that al-Qurtubi or others may mention in the books of tafsir, and not because it's in the book of tafsir or the book of hadith, it doesn't mean that that's authentic and resembles everything about Islamic knowledge. Okay. And I would like to, sometimes even mention a hadith, even if it's not authentic, just to even equip us with the ilm of these hadith when sometimes we would come across them. And the other thing is that right now, especially with AI, you could easily translate a lot of different texts, and then you would think that, okay, I don't need ilm, I don't need any of that. I could just basically get that information on AI and actually not know that how to even use AI or not even know how to use these resources, and you end up basically confusing yourself. Okay, so certainly this hadith is there, but it is actually not an authentic hadith. In other words, its chain of narration has a problem. Well, does that mean that the rizq itself was actually not mentioned and therefore that doesn't exist? No. The idea itself that the Lord Almighty writes and knows people's provisions and all of that, that is already something that we have already written in the Quran. We know it in other hadith. But this particular hadith is not an authentic hadith. That's all what we're trying to say. Okay, that's all we need to know. All right, let's see. I want you to look at this one. He said, and this is extremely important, he said that what is intended by the leaf that is mentioned in this ayah, he said it basically is referring to the different miscarriages that basically are delivered, miscarriages, or probably the miscarriages from the children of Adam. And he said, Al-habba yuradu biha alladhi laysa bisaqt. And the seed is referring to whatever was not necessarily miscarried. In other words, the human being that was not miscarried, and therefore talking about the baby. And he said, "Waratub, ratub is ratub means what is moist." Okay, and he said what this was referring to is basically the living creature. And ilyabis, or something that is dry, is referred to something that is dead. But here's Ibn Atiyah. I want you to look at this one, because although I basically had given some of those similarities, Ibn Atiyah had completely objected this, and he said that this type of using a symbolic interpretation or a symbolic way of trying to do this tafsir, he said, is absolutely not acceptable and should not be considered of anything. So I want you to look at this one, because, there are certain groups, and specifically, I would say the Sufis in particular, not all Sufis. Remember, I praised a lot of different things in Sufis, and I sometimes would say, just this piece of it is probably something that needs to be considered as something that might actually take us into a deviation. Anyhow, so you know my stance on Sufis, no need to actually talk about that. Okay, but some of the mystical groups and some of the mystical interpretations can sometimes exaggerate in the way that they may use symbolic interpretations. Sometimes it would be way beyond what the text is actually saying, and they would consider a different way. And they said that there's a tafsir that is zahir and a tafsir that is batin. They said that there is a tafsir that is a surface one, and there's another tafsir that is batin, that is basically when you say batin, you're talking about something that is hidden, and this hidden piece of it is only understood by those that had reached the highest levels of a maqamat. And we're speaking about highest level of maqam, and some of the Sufi groups, not all, because not all Sufis are actually deviant in such interpretations, but you've got some Sufi groups would actually use that, and it is intended with it that they would consider that a certain level of a person in a high level of spirituality, that they're capable of seeing behind al-hujub, that they're capable of seeing behind the different different barriers that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically put in ghaib, that is, and that they have a direct relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, what they can see in interpretation is beyond our mind to comprehend. And therefore, we would just have to accept this hidden interpretation that we weren't capable of understanding. And a lot of that interpretation is actually based on using symbolic, metaphorical, and symbolic interpretations, and that actually can be really dangerous. It can be really dangerous because you're going into a very bumpy and a slippery road. Because the second that you get into symbolic interpretations and you get into metaphorical, then you end up going into something that the text itself is not saying, but you are making your own inference. And therefore, it's a form of editing the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a form of editing the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what, of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had scolded the people of the book for, he scolded them for tahrif al-Quran. This is a form of tahrif. Then this would be a form of tahrif. So when we were talking earlier about is it al-bar, is it al-bur, what is it really talking about, and how expansive are we talking about, and what is this talking about a certain stage? Is this giving me an inference that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of knowing all these different stages of plantation or stages of human beings, or was it really referring to human beings, or was it comparing things, if in letting us know if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in full awareness, in full ilm of all these different stages of that plant, then certainly you as a human being, if these plants don't even have a purpose to their life, but to be subjugated to be basically a product that you as a human being would consume, and that was in Kitabin Mubin, then your life, which has a purpose, would actually require even more to be in a Kitabin Mubin within all the different stages of your life. If a plant and its different stages, if things and their different, and the different things and wherever they may be were mentioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and known to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then how is it with you as a human being? Did you think that you would be an exception and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not record your rizq or would not be in control of your rizq? That's the whole idea, basically in a nutshell, just to let us know these areas of tafsir. Let's see. And another tafsir had said, وَمَا تَسْقُطُ مِنْ وَرَقَةٍ. This is talking about the actual leaf on a tree, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted us to know that whether when it falls, where it falls, and how many times it probably flips in the air before it basically lands on earth, or whatever it is, or whether we're speaking about a certain seed, when it sprouts, when it basically is ripe, and who's going to eat it, etc. That it's all in the ilm of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, it's talking about the different dimensions. Now, let's say, في ظلمات الأرض. ظلمات الأرض, he said, بطونها. What is البطن? البطن is the stomach. But this isn't talking about, a stomach, that earth has a stomach and has a leg and has a that. No, this is actually talking about the core of something. Okay, so ظلمات الأرض, this is talking about, and notice that it said ظلمات and not ظلمة. It wasn't talking about one darkness, but it was talking about different levels and different stages of darkness within the different levels of earth. They probably had thought that it's just one ball, a ball of soil, and if you were to dig deep down, 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 you're going to just basically come across soil and more soil and more soil, and that's basically the end of it. But then right now with science, we discovered that no, there's actually another level, or actually multiple levels, and each and every single one of these levels has its own texture, has its own basically body, and its own thickness, and to think of earth as just one ball of perhaps of rocks or one ball of soil is completely wrong. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said ظulumat. ظulumat meaning number of different phases of darknesses, different stages, different phases, different cores, etc. And he said, وَهَذَا أَصَحْ. Said, and that is more accurate. When it says في ظلمات الأرض, this is talking about meaning inside the core of earth. Why did he say, and this is more accurate? He said, because it basically would be in coherence with the different hadith, and even in coherence with the inference that we would find within the ayah. Okay, and he said other scholars actually said ظلمات الأرض to actually mean, that's one quite interesting, يعني الصخرة التي هي أسفل الأرضين السابعة، الأراضين السابعة. So what does that mean? I'm going to interpret exactly what he said. This is probably going into a different thing. He said it's basically the rock that is at the lower end of the seventh earth. Wait. So what did they imagine earth looking like? He said this is actually talking about some kind of a sakhra, some kind of a huge, I guess, a huge stone or a huge rock. And that's basically at the lowest one of the 7 different levels of earth. That's what he's saying. Would be quite interesting to see what the Greek had thought at the time. Why am I saying the Greek? Because in order to look at this interpretation, where does it come from? Does it come from Arabic science, Muslim science? What did they believe about Earth at the time? How did they think of the structure of Earth? So here he's talking about some big stone in the core of Earth. We know that. Let's get Earth, right? And let's look right there. We're gonna get Earth, but we don't want that blue sphere. What should we write? And let's say core, maybe. Maybe we could do that. Let's see. Yeah, there you go. We did it. What are they talking about right there? I wonder if al-Qurtubi was actually talking about this. Did they actually imagine that this outer core was actually there? Is this what he was talking about? And why did they imagine? And that's why I said the Greek. I wonder if they had taken this theory from the Greek. Well, certainly they didn't dig that deep to know that. But why did they imagine of that? Why did they think of the inner core? Is this the Sahra they're talking about? And certainly no one during that time dug far enough to actually get to the outer core. The farthest that they probably went through was basically the crust, not even close to the mantle, perhaps. Or is it possible to, I don't know, how far could they dig? Or maybe they had something really big and then they sold. I don't know. It would be really interesting, but I just wanted to note that one. So you're looking at all of this. Basically, was this a diagram that was drawn by the Greek? Did they draw something like this? I don't know. Did the Arab imagine or even create their theories and think of Earth basically containing these different layers of Earth? So when he said السابعة right there, that there are 7 layers of Earth. We only see what? 1, 2, 3, 4. And what about this one? Maybe but according to the Quran, there are 7 layers. So I guess they need to do further research, or maybe this picture is outdated. Let's see, do they have further? Let's see right there. And yeah, it just gives me this one. Let's see this one. Let's see, Earth structure. Telling me, oh, this one's quite interesting. Lithosphere. How many does it have? So we've got the outer one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Got 7 right there. That's the core. So that's what al-Qurtubi was talking about. He was actually talking about the core. And it's nickel and sulfur. He's talking about that one. He said, أسفل الأرضين السبع. It's quite interesting. Wonder, okay, so to dig this deep and to go to this one, that's 100 kilometers. Man, 60 miles of digging, that'll be, that's a lot. Okay, let's see if we dug further deep. We'll do 430 miles. There's no way that anybody's going to dig this much without some serious types of, yeah, it's going to be, 60 miles is actually almost impossible to dig that long or that deep, unless you would have these very sophisticated type of, these big tools, machineries. It'd be 100 kilometers. Man, that's, even if you had these types of machineries, you won't be able to dig that much unless you went into a mountain, on the top of a mountain that's probably very high up, to see the different layers and then create your theory of what's under. Who knows how they did this study, but of course, I'm just trying to understand right there, as-Sakhra, and is how did al-Qurtubi, or even during their time, actually have this idea that there was this core under 7 layers? I have no idea. I absolutely have no idea, because for sure there's no way that they dug 100 kilometers. And even if they were to dig 100 kilometers, even if we were to somehow, say that they dug that deep, and then they would still come to this one. That's even worse. That's 700 kilometers. So there's absolutely no way that they can go to this one. And if they got to this one, absolutely no way that they can dig. There's absolutely no way. This is far sophisticated. And look at it. The deeper you go, the further the distance. Okay? This is Ya Allah. Okay. وَلَا رَطْبٍ وَلَا يَابِسٍ إِلَّا فِي كِتَابٍ. Okay. Well, we're going to right there. إِلَّا فِي كِتَابٍ. So which kitab are we talking about? في اللوح المحفوظ. It's talking about اللوح المحفوظ. What is اللوح المحفوظ? We talked about that one. اللوح المحفوظ is basically اللوح, meaning tablet. المحفوظ is the preserved tablet. Basically contains what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically written in relationship to al-ghaib. Okay? So therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said, إِلَّا فِي كِتَابٍ مُبِينٍ. Not that so He won't forget, but that because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not forget, but that's in order to let us know of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ilm. So we basically have this ilm, and therefore, all of these ayat are to let us know that if اعلموا, look at this quote, اعلموا أن هذا الذي ليس فيه ثواب ولا عقاب مكتوب فكيف بما فيه ثواب وعقاب. That's the key thing. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, when no, in other words, the inference is, no, if all of this that is not accountable, and they're, the different seeds, they're not accountable, and they're basically just not even having free will, if they would be in control and basically under Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's scrutiny and under Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's vision, how about, and what would the case be with you that basically has a thawab and the iqab, basically has a certain conduct that they need to relate to, that is, there's a certain judgment accountability, punishment, reward, then therefore there would be a special type of scrutiny that if these stages of different plants or these stages, whether we're speaking about al-Barr and al-Bahar on land, on sea, etc., if these things, we may consider them as trivial, but if this does not go outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge, how would it be with you that is considered as the subject of creation? The subject of creation. وهو الذي يتوفاكم بالليل ويعلم ما جرحتم بالنهار ثم يبعثكم فيه ليقضى أجل مسمى ثم إليه مرجعكم ثم ينبئكم بما كنتم تعملون. يتوفاكم بالليل. It's quite interesting. Here he said ينيمكم, okay, that he would put you to sleep. And then therefore he would take your souls that you use in order to distinguish things. And that it's not actually true death, but it is actually a type that the souls are basically taken into this type of preservation, that is, and is not given the ability to basically control it during sleep. Exactly, and very similar to death. Wait, so how does that look like again? So when you sleep, certainly you can be sleeping and then you're probably, I don't know, probably scratching your head and you didn't even realize, okay? Or you're probably maybe flipping or, left and right and you probably didn't even realize that you were changing sides, okay? Or maybe even grabbing your blanket and you didn't even realize that you had grabbed your blanket, okay, during your sleep, okay? But this isn't talking about that. This is talking about the soul, the spirit, and that it is not given to you to fully access. So you're not accessing while you're asleep the world around you. You're not accessing and you're not aware of your own self even. You're not aware of how to basically make decisions or move in any way, so it becomes similar to death. This person is asleep and is totally unaware of the world around him. Totally unaware of what's happening. So it becomes like death. This person, in body, they're there. But in terms of soul and spirit, they're absolutely not there. That's quite scary. If you think of it, it's quite scary to think of sleep as a form of death. You die every single day and you wake up from death. That's so scary. So that's why this ayah is reminding us, يَتَوَفَّاكُمْ بِاللَّيْلِ. You die every single night and then you're resurrected again. That's why the sunnah, when you're about to fall asleep or when you're going to sleep, is to make the dua. اللهم باسمك وضعت جنبي وبك أرفع اللهم إن أمسكت نفسي فارحمها وإن أرسلتها فاحفظها بما تحفظ به عبادك الصالحين. Ya Allah, I rest my side in your name and I raise it in your name. Ya Allah, if you hold my soul, then preserve it with what you had preserved the souls of the Salihin, of those that are pious. And if you let go, in other words, you basically, إن أرسلتها فاحفظها ما تحفظ وإن أرسلتها اللهم أمسكت نفسي فارحمها. If you hold it, then be merciful on it. And if you let go, فاحفظها بما تحفظ به عبادك الصالحين. Then preserve it with what you preserve your pious servants. It's quite interesting. We know a lot of people that died while they're asleep, don't we? Ya Rabbi. Okay, he said, well, in here, he wanted to say, التوفي استيفاء الشيء. He said, التوفي, what is استيفاء الشيء? استيفاء الشيء is when something is completed. So توفي الميت, if a dead person توفي, that actually means he had completed the designated number of days that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given him. Okay? And the person that is asleep, it is as they had completed their life throughout the day. And الوفاة is الوفاة, the verb يتوفاكم وفي. الوفاة is basically when a person completes the number of days that they had basically been assigned to live. So when you say أوفيتك المال, that actually means I had given it to you. توفيت الشيء استوفيته. In other words, I had completed it. Let's see. It was mentioned that when the soul departs the body during sleep, that some life is in it. And that's why the person would be capable of breathing, moving, but once their limit is basically done, think of it as, like a certain amount, kind of like, what do they call that? It's those kind of clocks, like a sand thing. What do they call those? Sand clocks, or what do they call those? And then, of course, the time is basically the amount of sand that's falling within that. And then what happens, and it could be that their time was up during their sleep. And then they would basically become dead and they can't move and not even breathe. Some actually said يتوفاكم. It doesn't necessarily mean that our souls depart, but it just means that it goes outside of our own awareness. يخرج من الذهن. So we're just not aware of it. That's it. Okay. But of course, that's the most important thing. He said, this is something that is part of ghaib. We don't know much about. Why did it use that? What happens during sleep? In other words, sleep and knowing what really sleep is in itself is a secret. It's basically من الغيب. ثم يبعثكم فيه. Meaning, hold on. Let's go to that ayah. Right? Let's see this ayah. We're actually on this ayah. Let me just erase all of this, right? And we're going to basically right there, just erase all these blues. Okay? So that way we can be on the same page, right? And let's see. And what are we doing? So let's see. ثم يبعثكم فيه. So هو الذي يتوفاكم بالليل. So stage number 1, during the night, يتوفاكم. And during the day, you basically had went on to work during the day. ثم يبعثكم فيه ليقضى أجل مسمى. And then you are resurrected in order to complete a certain amount of time. So يبعثكم فيه, that's in order to let us see the comparison between what happens during the day and what happens during the night, that's very similar to what happens in life and how people would later die, is that it basically comes within the same concept. That just as you would sleep and you would become like a dead person, and then you would wake up, that's the same way. Then there's a mission to go to, etc. That's exactly how life is. That just as you would sleep and wake up, that's exactly how death and then resurrection would basically take place. ثم إليه مرجعكم, and then your return is to him, and you would be told of what you had done. So what? This is just to inform me this is what you did. I mean, it's not like I don't know. No, this is to, in other words, to hold you accountable. Okay. In another قراءة ثم يبعثكم فيه ليقضي أجلا مسمى. It's quite interesting. وجرحتم بمعنى كسبتم. What is جرحتم? جرحتم, جرح actually means to cause a wound. And جرح can also mean كسب, meaning to acquire something. Okay. And you could see when it was talking about يتوفاكم بالليل يبعثكم بالنهار يعلم ما جرحتم فيه, that you would basically, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically know what you had done at night and throughout the day, and then throughout the day he basically knows what you had committed or what you had done in it. And therefore that's for us to know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he gives the disbelievers the time of life, and that basically they would use that time within their day for something that is not of their benefit, it's basically the total loss. For the Lord Almighty had considered everything as within a certain accountability, and he had confirmed it, and he had known about it, and that their Lord Almighty would basically have a certain amount of days and a certain amount of power basically to give this rizq and provision for this person. Then they would return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he would hold them accountable. And in other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to show us that, I guess, inference in regards to resurrection, and let us see that just as the second resurrection, or because why am I, let's go to Surah Zumar. We need to see Surah Zumar for this one, right? Let's see, this is page 144. Let's go to Surah Zumar. We need to jump into Surah Zumar because ربنا أمتنا اثنتين وحييتنا اثنتين. So Surah Al-Qalam. Let's go to Surah Zumar. Oh, this is past it. Surah Zumar is, here we go. Zukhruf, a little bit more. What are we here? Fussilat, okay. A little bit more. What are we looking at here? Ghafir, one more surah. Okay. And let's go for Surah Al-Zumar. Here it is. And let's see. This is what they said. Oh. Where is it? Am I wrong? No, where is it? I can't believe I lost it. So what was the ayah about? Let me get it right here. Okay. I'm gonna ربنا أمتنا اثنتين وأحييتنا اثنتين. That's the one that we're trying to get to. Oh, it was in Surah Ghafir. That's why I skipped it. Okay. Yeah, okay. I skipped that one. Okay, that's all right. Okay, in Surah Ghafir. Skipped it then. We're going to go to Surah Ghafir and actually see it. Okay, here we go. Here's Surah Ghafir. And what were they saying? Here we go. And what would they say? Here we go. قالوا ربنا أمتنا اثنتين وأحييتنا اثنتين فاعترفنا بذنوبنا فهل إلى خروج من سبيل. So what happened? They said, "O Lord," that is on Judgment Day, "you had put us to death twice. You had put us to life twice. And we had confessed of our sins. Is there a way out?" What's quite interesting is that it said أَمَتَّنَا اثْنَتَيْنِ. And 2 times you had put us to death, 2 times you had put us to life. So what does that look like? Why did it say, why on Judgment Day, that we would say that we died twice? Because we weren't existent and then we died. So that was when we did not, of course, when were you in 1800s? None of you were alive. you were dead. Okay? And then you lived. That's your first hayat. That's your first life. And then you died. That's your second death. And then you lived, which is what? Where's the second living? Second living is basically on Judgment Day. So they would say, Ya Allah, you had brought us to life twice. The first time you brought us to life was in this life, dunya. And the second time you brought us to life was in the akhirah. So they say, فَاعْتَرَفْنَا بِذُنُوبِنَا. But I want you to look at this one because it said, أَمَتَّنَا. So this mauta right here is different than what happens, of course, while we're asleep. Okay? So just to see this one, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting us see, He said, دَلَّ عَلَى الْحَشْرِ وَالنَّشْرِ بِالْبَعْثِ لأن النشأة الثانية منزلتها بعد الأولى كمنزلة اليقظة بعد النوم. So because when you're looking at comparing the two, is that it's basically coming in as النشأة الثانية, the second time that we would be created in, it would basically be after the first time. In other words, it's similar to waking up from sleep. Okay? So this is it, inshallah. I know today, because it's Friday, so inshallah, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. No questions? Let's say all right. Oh, go ahead, dear. Humaira, go ahead.
Sheikha, I would like to ask, you said the second life is the Judgment Day. What about the Alam al-Barzakh? Isn't that a second life for us?
So Alam al-Barzakh is actually part of Judgment Day.
So that's it's the same realm. I thought it's a different realm.
No, it's within خلاص. If a person dies, قامت قيامته. If a person dies, that means their qiyamah had already begun.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
SubhanAllah.
So their qiyamah had already begun, not meaning that they're going to basically be delivered to Jannah and we're going to skip everything else. No, but their qiyamah officially had basically started, meaning that they're not in dunya anymore. And Yawm al-Qiyamah, or al-Qiyamah basically, okay, has different stages to it. So al-Barzakh, think of it as the threshold of Yawm al-Qiyamah. All right?
I get it. Jazakallah khairan.
Wa iyyakum. Anybody else wants to say something?